Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Boyd, and I'm a developer advocate at Google, focused on Google Apps and the apps marketplace. But today, we're actually here to talk about OpenID and OAuth and how they work for identity and data access. If you have any questions throughout the talk, you can save them for the end. We will have a Q&A period. Of course, I'll also be around the rest of the conference in between the sandbox and office hours and things like that. And you can reach me online via my Twitter profile, RyGuyRG, and my Google profile is linked there as well. And lastly, there's a feedback link at the top right, which looks good. The box gets slightly cut off on the screen, but you can record your feedback there, and that will be helpful for me to improve the talk for the future. All right, so what are we here to talk about? There's a number of items on our agenda, but basically it breaks down to talking about OpenID and talking about OAuth, and then talking about a couple different scenarios for each of those, including how to handle mobile authentication, as well as how to handle OAuth for businesses and organizations. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the future of these technologies, and the future is going to come quite quickly in this case. So, all right, terminology. Terminology is really key to understanding these topics. I hope I don't bore you too much by introducing new terms and describing them a couple different ways, but that's what I'm going to be doing. So I'm going to talk, with each term, I'm going to try to talk about them in a real-world use case, and then try to talk about them in an online use case. And hopefully, between those two, you can get them, because it'll really help understanding. So the first term we're going to talk about today is authentication. Authentication is about verifying the identity of a user, knowing that the user is who they say they are. In the case of Colonel Tom visiting a top-secret military establishment, his identity is verified using a scan of his eye. Then after his identity is verified by the folks at the military base, they then need to decide what Colonel Tom should have access to. In particular, what rooms on the military base Colonel Tom should be able to go into. And that's what authorization is all about, making sure that someone has the right access and only the right access when they go to access some resources. All right, so in the online world, let's meet Bob. Everyone say hi to Bob. Hi, Bob. All right, Bob is an administrative assistant at Acme Corporation, and Bob uses his computer every single day. And the first thing Bob does when he goes to his computer is log in. He types in a username and a password. That gets sent off to the server, and the server says, hey, is this the correct password for this username? And if so, the user is considered authenticated. The server thinks that if this person provided the right password for this account, then it must, in fact, be that person. Not always true, as you guys know, but that's the basics of authentication as it works in most websites. But after the user's authenticated, we need to figure out what access the user should have. So in the case of this Acme Corporation, we have Bob being able to access his own mail, but not being able to access the mail of the other people in the organization. So Bob is authenticated to his Acme Corp account and has authorized access to his mailbox. Now, to put these in context for the presentation, for authentication, we're going to be primarily talking about OpenID, and when authenticating a user using OpenID when they're visiting a website. And then for OAuth, we're primarily talking about getting authorized access to a user's data, kind of delegated access to a user's data that is stored elsewhere, in this case at Google. All right, so authenticating users via OpenID, or authentication of users via OpenID. That's what I get for adding slides at the last minute. OpenID terminology. So let's get into some terms and first talk about identity providers. The most common identity provider that you're probably familiar with is the Department of Motor Vehicles. When you go there, you prove your identity to them, and they issue a driver's license. And that driver's license says, hey, this is Tom, this is Tom's birth date, and some other information. Now, if you take that driver's license, walk to your car, and speed out of the parking lot and get pulled over by a cop, that cop is what's called a relying party. That cop is relying upon the assertion of your identity by the identity provider in order to write you a ticket. So he looks at the driver's license, and the picture matches. He says, this is Tom, this is his birthday, this is his address, et cetera, and he issues you the ticket. Now, how does this work in the online world? Let's give you an example of federated identity in the online world, and we'll bring Bob back. So Bob is an administrative assistant, but he's often traveling. He's on the road, rushing to catch his next plane, and he doesn't always remember where he's going next. So he stores his itineraries in a travel planning service called TripIt. TripIt is basically a place you can store your itineraries and share them with your friends and colleagues. And he goes to TripIt, but he doesn't want to have to create another account. He doesn't want to have to create another password. So he goes to TripIt and he says, TripIt, I want to use my Google account to log in. And TripIt says, OK, Google, who is this guy? And Google returns and says, hey, TripIt, this is Bob. So in this case, we have Bob as the end user, TripIt as the relying party, and Google as the identity provider. And we have success. The user is authenticated to his TripIt account using his Google identity, and most importantly, never actually had to have a password on TripIt. Because Google was asserting his identity to TripIt, he only necessarily had to have a password at Google. So why do we care about OpenID? We cared about OpenID for a number of different reasons. I'm going to go through several of them here. But basically, users can log into all sites using their existing accounts. They don't have to create new accounts and new identities to log into websites. All right, so this is the quote that's on the front page of OpenID.net, or was at the time that I looked. OpenID is a safe, faster, and easier way to log into websites. We're going to go through each of these points. We're going to start with faster and easier and get back to safe. But I truly believe in this. So faster and easier. Let's look at a traditional sign-up process. So traditional sign-up process is a fictitious app called Sassy Payroll. Just a screenshot here. But this is a typical sign-up process where you fill out your first name, last name, email address, provide a password, double enter that password. And if you're like me, you often typo that password when you double enter it. So this takes a little bit of time. But you fill out this form, and then you get an email sent to you that confirms that you have that email address. And this whole process took about 50 keystrokes and 3 mouse clicks. Of course, if you have a more complicated password, it may have taken you even more. But this is a really bad process. This process makes babies cry. And why are babies crying? Babies are crying because even babies know that you can offer a better user experience for signing up for a website. Even babies know, or should know, about OpenID and how you can offer an improved user experience with OpenID. So let's take a look at that same sort of process and see how that works in OpenID. This is the login box at one time on a website called Tungle. And they're presenting a variety of different options for you to log in using an existing account that you already have. These are a variety of different identity providers, and this is often referred to as something like the OpenID NASCAR. That was a term someone else came up with, but it's a good way to describe it. It's basically a bunch of different logos. And in here, you can choose from one of the major identity providers to log in with. It doesn't actually provide the option for you to log in with your own identity and your own identity provider if you're a real geek. And that's unfortunate for many people, but it is actually what you see most often because it's easier for users. So they see this, and if you have a Google account, you click on the Google button. You're already logged into your Google account, so you get prompted, hey, would you like to allow or deny access to your Google account? And you say, hey, I'm going to allow access, and then you're signed into the website. It was really that simple. This whole process was 0 keystrokes and 2 mouse clicks. This is making puppies happy. Now, who would rather make puppies happy than babies cry? Hopefully, everyone? All right. This is what it's all about. It's basically making your users happier and not making your babies cry. So now let's talk about safer. We've talked about faster and easier. How is it safer? It's safer for a number of different reasons. You have one username and password. You don't have to create username and passwords for every different site you visit. You have one. Because you only have one, that password can be ultra secure. It can be something that you really are going to remember, and you're going to remember every single time that you go to enter it. My typical password is many times the length of the 8-character limitation that sites give you. It always frustrates me when I'm limited at 8 characters because I want to have an ultra-secure password. And I can have an ultra-secure password because there's only a few places I actually provide that password. The password is only provided to the identity provider. Only the identity provider ever sees that password. All these other sites, all the other relying parties never see a password from you. This makes it definitely much safer because most users, actually, how many of you reuse the same password on multiple sites? See? It's very helpful to have that one password provided to the identity provider and only the identity provider. Now, in addition to having a password, you can also have what's called two-factor auth and other protections. How many of you are familiar with two-factor auth? All right, so I don't have to explain that to most of you. For those of you who are not, that don't understand it, basically the idea is security is done in layers, and one of those layers is something you know, your password. Another layer might be something that you are, which is like the eye scan of Colonel Tom, but the last layer might be something that you have. When I go to log into my typical identity provider, I'm actually prompted to not enter the password and only the password, but asked to enter in a one-time password as well. It's basically, the way Google has implemented mostly for external purposes is you get an SMS message or you get a notification on your mobile device, and it proves that you have something in your possession in addition to knowing the password. It makes it quite easy and also quite secure because only if you have that in your possession and know the password are you able to log into sites. All right, so safe, faster, easier. Safer, the user only provides their one ultra-secure password to their identity provider, and that ultra-secure password can be backed up with something like two-factor auth. The user is often already logged into their identity provider, so it's super fast, as you saw earlier, and the user doesn't need to create the other username and password. Now, this is how it's safer, faster, and easier for your users. The next question, though, is how is it easier for you as developers? And we're going to talk a little bit about becoming an OpenID relying party and how this makes things easier for you, or doesn't in some cases, but at least it makes it easier for your users. All right. So I'm going to assert that OpenID is easy to implement. Now, how many of you would disagree with me? How many of you have looked at this at all? All right, good. It's easy to implement, but it's not easy enough. It's not easy enough because there are a huge number of edge cases. Now, I've worked with probably a couple hundred OpenID replying parties over the last couple years on the Google Apps Marketplace. And these edge cases are things that a lot of people don't deal with to start out with. These edge cases are things that you can get by without implementing it first. You can implement the basics of OpenID using OpenID libraries. There are a variety of different libraries and different languages that you can use and get by without implementing these edge cases. But if you do that, then your customer support folks get the burden of the problem. And that's because there are edge cases such as an existing user wants to switch to using OpenID, or an OpenID user wants to switch back to using a password. User changes their email address, what do you do? And a variety of other edge cases, and there's a link at the bottom here where those are documented. But a variety of different edge cases that most OpenID relying parties don't actually implement, and then their customer support people get angry, and the cost of them implementing OpenID is actually more than the benefits that they're achieving from it. So you kind of have to implement these edge cases, and everyone will eventually deal with them. But let's make it easier. Let's make it easier to implement OpenID. Let's make it easier to become a relying party. And we're going to do that by introducing to you the Google Identity Toolkit. Now, what you're seeing here probably doesn't look that exciting. You just see a username and password. But you might see the second tab over here that says Connect with any account. And that Connect with any account tab has a couple different options. It has Gmail, Yahoo, AOL, and Hotmail is actually now on the official list. And this allows you to log in using your existing identity, but with less pain as developers. And it has less pain because we provide a mixture of 3 components here: JavaScript UI widgets, client libraries, and code on Google's servers to actually make this process a lot easier for you as developers. And it's easier for you, but it's also more prescriptive. Basically, we provide interfaces for you to implement. And if you implement those interfaces, we actually are dealing with a lot of the different edge cases that we talked about earlier. Now, this project is just kind of in testing currently. I will have at the end of the presentation some email address and that sort of thing that you can reach out to get to test this project. But it should be fully out soon. If you search for it right now on the web, I think you probably come to a website about it. But again, more at the end of the presentation in the resources section. Now, the Google Identity Toolkit supports two different flavors of OpenID. It supports using OpenID only for sign up, so that when users go to sign up for your application, you can sign them up using their existing identities. And you get some special information by that. You get their name, you get their email address. It basically prevents the user from having to enter in some of the common information. And then you can authenticate the users via password after you sign them up. Now, I personally don't like this, as you can imagine. I'd much rather you implemented OpenID for sign up and also for your day-to-day login. However, many websites aren't comfortable with that, so we do offer both of these options in the Google Identity Toolkit to be as flexible as possible. And then there are a variety of different identity providers that you can use, and I believe it's an option when you're configuring it. You can choose which of these different identity providers to accept. All right, so now that we talked about making it easier for you to implement OpenID using the Google Identity Toolkit, let's show you what it actually looks like. There's a quick video here. I say connect with any account. I click on Gmail. A little pop-up occurs. I agree to pass on that information. I say allow. And again, my name and my email address. And then it's asking me for some additional information in one of these example widgets. So the Google Identity Toolkit makes it easier for you as a web application developer to implement OpenID. But I have, with working with all these different partners, I have one question that keeps on coming up. And that question is, when users are logging into my website with OpenID, they don't have a password. And when they don't have a password, how can they use my mobile applications? So they have mobile applications, native mobile applications that exist on iPhones and Androids and BlackBerries. These native mobile apps typically have a username and password field. And they don't need to know how to authenticate their users that are authenticated to their website with just an OpenID. And the problem here is that they have code that may have been written by a contractor or written by someone who's moved on to another project. It's native code sitting on their devices. So how do they deal with that? One option is allow the users to create a password. Now, this isn't my favorite option, as you might imagine, but it's the easiest option for developers. So all of these different options are basically on the scale of, is it easier for developers or is it easier for users? Somewhere along that scale, these options are fitting. This is kind of at the extreme end. It's really easy for developers because they just need to add something in their settings panel that allows the user to create a password. Concur is an application on the apps marketplace, and they've done exactly that. If you go to their settings panel, you can choose to create a password, and that password's used to authenticate you in the mobile device. But let's get a little bit better. Let's not allow the users to come up with a password and reuse a password that they might have already used on many other sites. Let's generate a password that's reasonably complex and give it to them. This is actually a screenshot from one of the Google interfaces that if you're using the two-factor auth, you have the ability to do this. You have the ability to go in and say, I want to create a password for this particular mobile app or this particular website or what have you. And it gives you a password. You only see that password once. It's kind of assumed that that mobile application is remembering your identity. Most mobile applications, once you log into them, they assume that your mobile phone is fairly secure and don't make you log in on a regular basis. So this works OK for that. But the user still needs to go and figure out where this is and get that password and enter it. So OpenID. Did y'all guess that that's what I was going to talk about here as my favorite way, hopefully? OpenID is really my favorite way to authenticate mobile devices and native mobile applications. Now, OpenID wasn't designed for this. I'm not going to go out and say this was the whole point of OpenID. OpenID is really about websites, but OpenID can work on native applications and native mobile applications in particular. And so we're going to talk about how that's done. So this is the TripIt application on an Android. TripIt is the travel planning service I mentioned earlier. Basically, they have native mobile applications on several different platforms. This is their application on Android. So you click on the sign up to TripIt or sign in to TripIt, and basically it pops up a web page like this. This is popping up in a new browser window outside of the application. And when this pops up, you actually first get a thing to create a new account for TripIt. I skipped that screen. This is about signing in. And you see the link at the bottom that says sign in with your Google account. You click and sign in with Google. And again, since you're already logged into your account on your mobile device, you're prompted just to allow. Now, a little tip and trick for those of you who go about implementing this. Some people will implement this flow by using an embedded web browser in the application. If you do that, that embedded browser often has a different cookie store, cookie jar, than your main web browser. So even if a user was logged in the main web browser, they'll have to log in again. That's why I much prefer the flow of actually popping up the native browser on the device and not trying to do an embedded web view. So I can just here allow, click allow, and I'm into TripIt. It's really that simple. So it's a four-step process. 1, 2, 3, 4 for the user. Like I said, OpenID is not designed for this, so it can be a little bit tricky for the developer. But for the user, it's really simple. Some people still are concerned about this pop-up web browser, but I would much rather have the UI of having a web browser pop up than having to enter my password on a mobile device with that little thumb keyboard. So this is how you can deal with authentication on mobile devices. If you have some questions about how to deal with authorization, how to get access to a user's calendar or contacts or something like that on a mobile device, there was actually a session yesterday, which you can catch hopefully tomorrow on YouTube. The session was called Client Login Hash Fail, and that session did go into a little bit more detail about how to deal with using OAuth from mobile devices. The other thing that they talked about in that session is a little bit more of the future of how this will work and how we can make it easier for you as developers by essentially having a native application on the device which you as developers can talk to get the user's identity and access to their data rather than having to go through the OpenID dance. So check out that session and look for things happening in the future there. But that's a really good transition into getting authorized data access via OAuth. Now, OAuth is an open protocol. OAuth is an open protocol just like OpenID, but its point is to get delegated and authorized access from users to data. So you might ask why I care or why you care. You care because there are a bunch of different APIs out there that you can use to get access to with this technology. There are 35 plus APIs at Google that are authorized via OAuth. And these 35 plus APIs do a variety of different things. And not only are there 35 plus APIs at Google, but there are hundreds and hundreds of APIs around the web that are authorized using OAuth. But what matters is what those APIs provide your application. So those APIs at Google, I'm going to give you a couple examples about the type of data that your app can access using OAuth. First one is contacts. Let's say you have a web application and you want to allow users to invite other users, their friends and that sort of thing, to your application. And those users are storing that data in Google Contacts. Well, it's pretty simple for you to use OAuth and get access to their data and pull a feed of the user's contacts and allow them to send emails to their friends inviting them to your website. Calendar, your application manages events in some way, and you want to allow the users to add events to their own calendars because they use Google Calendar on a regular basis, and that's where they want to store the history of all their events and keep track of them in one place. You can use the Calendar API. Picasa web albums, YouTube, some other cases where if you want to embed a user's photos or get access to a user's videos, you could do all that by getting authorized access with OAuth. And then the rest of it is kind of read-only feeds. Most of these are based off the Atom publishing protocol. So once you get authorized access with OAuth, you're reading an XML or Atom-based feed using a standard REST scenario. So fairly simple. But why do you need to learn this really fancy protocol in order to get access to users' data? Why don't you just ask them for their password? All right. You shouldn't ask them for their password. But how many of you seen websites that look like this? Tell us your Gmail account. We promise we won't tell anyone your password. You guys all seen this? Well, it really irritates me every time I see it because I know there's a better way, and the babies are out there crying because they know there's a better way. You can access a user's data with their password. That is correct. Right now, our APIs do allow you to take the user's username and password and get access to their data. But this is really bad because the user is granting access to their entire account at that point. They're not just granting access to the one API or two APIs that your application needs access to. They're granting access to everything in their Google account, the whole world. You do not want that as a user, and you don't want to ask your users to do that as a developer because the smart users will stand back and say, no, I really don't want to do that. And as dumb users will just give you their password and you'll have a database full of passwords, and that's just a really bad thing. So don't put yourself in that risk scenario as a user or as a developer. All right, so some terminology with OAuth. We have a protected resource. This is the resource on a server that requires authorization to access. We have the resource owner, the person that owns the protected resource and approves access. And then we have the server. The server is holding the protected resource and deciding whether or not it should grant access. And then the client. Again, we're going to use this SASE payroll example as a web application which needs access to data that's stored on the server. All right, so which flavor of OAuth do you use? OAuth, there's plenty of different flavors at Google and other providers. And what flavor of OAuth you use depends on who owns the data. You can have individual ownership of data, where every user gets to decide, this is my data, I'm going to grant this application access to my data. And that user can make that decision. But then you can also have company-owned resources. So think of something like, you're in a very large company, and that company has calendars, for instance. You have your corporate calendar. You might have some confidential stuff on your corporate calendar. Your company does not trust you to be the one deciding whether a third-party app can grant access or can get access to the calendar. So you have these IT guardians that sit and make those decisions, evaluate the security of apps, and that sort of thing. So we're going to go through these two scenarios and the different flavors of OAuth that are used in these two different flavors. So we're going to start off by the individual grant case, where the individual owns the resource. And I'm going to be somewhat lazy here and use the application SASE payroll to demonstrate this. And why I say somewhat lazy is because this is really an individual use case that we're talking about. So let's imagine that we're at a very small company of just a couple employees. There's no IT guardians to protect us. But we have this payroll application, and we want to allow this payroll application to add our pay dates onto our Google Calendar. Again, we keep track of all of our dates in our Google Calendar in one place, and we want to know when our payroll is coming up without having to log into the payroll app. So the payroll application could look something like this. They give you your paycheck, and then at the bottom, they have a link that allows you to add your pay dates to your calendar. This pops up a screen that looks like this. This is the OAuth 2 flow. And this screen basically says, hey, this SASE payroll application would like to manage your calendar, view and manage the events on your calendar. The user hits allow access, and all of a sudden the app, after a little redirect dance, can actually put the payroll dates or pay dates on your Google Calendar. So now you don't have to log into payroll each time you want to see when you get paid. Awesome. Now, let's talk about this in a little more detail and what the technical flow is. And we're going to start off by talking about this in the aspect of a developer going to build an app for the first time. The developer has to actually register their application and get a client ID and client secret from Google. And they go to a screen that looks like this. Google says, here's your client ID and client secret. And then the developer puts that in their production infrastructure somewhere in a secure fashion so that when they make future requests and a user visits the application, they have access to that data. So now the user came to that web page and said, I want to add my payroll dates to my Google Calendar. And the web developer does a few things in their code, of course. The application will redirect the user over to Google and includes a client ID, includes a redirect URI, which is the URI to redirect the user back to after they're done this process, and includes a scope. The scope is basically what APIs that this application is trying to get access to. At Google, these scopes are often in the form of URLs. They don't have to be. And you can actually include multiple scopes at once. So we just asked for calendar here, but you could ask for calendar and contacts and YouTube and that sort of thing all at one try. All right, so the application redirects user to Google with that information. There's luckily no signatures or anything like that involved. It's just a clear URL that you're redirecting the user to. And then Google redirects the user back to the application, the redirect URI that was specified, and includes a code in that URL. And the URL looks something like this. It's a URL on the application, and then we have a code that says authorization code. And then the application performs a post to Google. And in that post, it basically includes its client ID and client secret, and also includes that code. When it does this, Google looks up and responds to that request by giving the application two main things. The first is this access token. This is the token that will be used to make requests to the API, and we're going to see how that works shortly. And then the second main thing is this refresh token. So the access token actually expires once every 3,920 seconds in this example. That can be a variable number, of course. And when that access token expires, you need to go off and get another access token. And you can do that using the refresh token. And this refresh token is actually, with Google in our current implementation, valid indefinitely until the user revokes it. So either before or after the token expires, you can use that refresh token to renew access. And we're going to see how that works here in a second. But first, let's take that access token and actually make a call to the API. We're going to make that call to the API, specifying that access token in one of two ways. You can specify it as a query parameter in your request. So just in the URL, you can say the OAuth token is this, or you could specify it as a header. Now, if you guys are going off and making the decision, well, which one should I use? Please use the header in most circumstances. I want you to use the header because the header is often not logged in proxy server logs or in your web server logs or things like that. Although these tokens are just valid for 3,920 seconds, it's still helpful for you to keep that data out of the logs and will make your app a little bit more secure. But that being said, the query parameter is also really useful for debugging. And the query parameter is useful if you're writing JavaScript applications. With this whole OAuth 2 flow, you can write JavaScript applications pretty much entirely within your browser and not have to have much server-side code. So that's helpful. We've made a call to the protected API. We've waited a period of time. There are 3,920 seconds, and I think I skipped something here. And we need to refresh the access token. You can refresh that access token, like I said, before or after the token has expired. So some applications might want to say, I'm using this access a lot. The user's active in their session, and it's been 3,800 seconds. Let me go off and refresh the access token behind the scenes. Or you might want to say, we're just going to wait until Google returns an error. And after Google returns an error, we're going to try to refresh this. You can do either one. Basically, you're specifying the client ID, client secret, and the refresh token and Google will return an access token to you. Pretty simple. So the whole flow works something like this. The developer registers the application at Google. The user visits the application. The application asks the user to authorize access data at Google. The Google clicks that Allow button and says, I'm going to grant access to this application. Google returns to the application with the code. Then the application actually requests an update, a access token from that code. And Google returns both that access token and the refresh token. And again, the refresh token is invalid indefinitely, even though the access token is expiring. Then the application can actually access Google Calendar by specifying that access token in either the URL or the query parameter. Google returns or updates protected data. Sometime later, you have to go through this renewal process by passing in the refresh token and getting back a new access token. So this is the whole OAuth 2 flow. I did not mention the word signatures at all. For those of you who have dealt with OAuth 1, that's kind of one of the bigger pain points of OAuth 1. But the next case that I'm going to introduce to you is going to be the business ownership of data. And with the business ownership of data, we are going to be using a flavor of OAuth 1, which has signatures. But hopefully, eventually, that's going to go away in favor of OAuth 2 based protocols. So in the business scenario, this is going to be the company owning the resource. There's this team of IT guardians who are protecting access to the data owned by a company, and they want to grant access. And there's two different ways that the company can grant access to data. And in these examples, the way that we deal with companies at Google is via Google Apps. So these two examples are going to be based off of Google Apps. And the first one is in the Google Apps control panel. A company can grant an application access to a particular API or scope, as we talked about earlier, via the Google Apps control panel by specifying the name of their client, the consumer key, and specifying the scope of data that it needs access to, or multiple scopes. So this would basically be saying Sassy Payroll can have access to Google Calendar, and once they authorize that in the Business Edition or Education Edition of Google Apps, once that's authorized, that application now has access to that API for every user within the organization. The other way is via the Google Apps Marketplace. So an application that's distributed on the Google Apps Marketplace can say, I need access to Google Calendar in order for my application to work. And when the IT administrator installs that application from the Apps Marketplace, they can grant access to that data in that one step during the install process. It's a very simple flow, makes it a lot easier than copying and pasting scopes and that sort of thing. All right, so after they do that, because the application has access to every user within the organization, their calendar, their contacts, and that sort of thing, then Sassy Payroll can not only update my calendar, but can also update the calendar of everyone else within the organization with their payroll dates, without those users ever having to actively log in. So remember, the administrator gave them permission to do this, and then they can go off in the background and update all these different calendars. And I may never actually have to see the payroll application because I know when I'm going to get paid. So let's go through what this looks like from a technical basis. There's the first step here. It actually is split into two, depending on whether you're an Apps Marketplace application or whether you're just trying to get access in the control panel. The one I'm showing here is the screen of where you need to go register as a developer if you just want the administrators to grant access in the Google Apps control panel. This is the OAuth 1 standard registration page, linked to from our documentation, which I'll refer to at the end of the talk. But this standard authorization page or registration page will give you this OAuth consumer key and secret. If you're an Apps Marketplace app, it's a very similar process in that you go and register your application, but Google actually gives you the consumer key and consumer secret at the time that you register. All right, so you've registered. The administrator grants access in one of those two different ways that we talked about. And then you start to make requests. And you make requests by including an authorization header. So that's the part that's kind of similar to before. There's an authorization header in your HTTP request. It references the key for the application and also references a couple other bits of data. If you're using OAuth 1, I would definitely recommend you use some library that implements OAuth 1. Google has a variety of libraries for it. OAuth 2, the stuff that we talked about before, because there's no signatures, that sort of thing, you're actually able to pretty easily write your own code that handles that. I did that kind of in less than an hour, accessing several different APIs using OAuth 2. That's fine. But with OAuth 1, you will want some sort of library because you need to generate these cryptographic signatures. And these cryptographic signatures are based off of a nonce, a timestamp, your consumer secret, and that sort of thing. But let's assume you have this library generating this authorization header for you, and you're accessing the calendar API. The other thing that you need to do is specify on whose behalf you're accessing the calendar API. So if you remembered inside the organization that we talked about with SASE Payroll, we had Ryan, Tim, Scott, a variety of different users. For each user, you need to specify their email address as the XOAuth requester ID when you're making the request to the API. And that's how you do it. Fairly simple, as long as you have that library backed up and helping you out with that authorization header. So here's the general flow. The developer registers the application. The admin visits the Google and authorizes the application in the control panel. And then the application, somehow or other I messed up my transitions here, but the application then accesses Google Calendar by specifying that XOAuth requester ID header, XOAuth requester ID, sorry, as a query parameter, and then an authorization header with a signature, and Google returns or updates the protected data. Then they can go through and access that data for another user by just specifying a different XOAuth requester ID. OK, so we talked about a number of different things. We talked about general terminology for authentication and authorization. Then we talked about OpenID authentication, mobile authentication, then how to use OAuth in two different scenarios. First, using OAuth, and this is OAuth 2, or 2.0, for accessing individual users' data. And then we talked about using OAuth 1, the two-legged flow, for accessing data that's authorized by businesses. Now, what's the future look like? The future is all about having one protocol for all use cases. You want a single protocol to handle both authentication and authorization. You're all probably thinking, why do we have both this OpenID and this OAuth thing? Really, we can eliminate one of them. And we can eliminate one of them because the process is essentially the same. If you look at this page was copied kind of from the OAuth 2 flow for an individual user granting access to their calendar. And I've modified it a little bit to say, this application would like access to your Google identity. And they'd like to view your email address and name. So instead of granting the application access to your calendar data, it's just granting access to your identity and that information. So essentially it's using OAuth 2 to get access to your identity and use OAuth 2 for authentication in addition to authorization. Now, there's certainly some different guarantees between the clients and servers going on here about what needs to happen when you're getting access to calendar versus what needs to happen when you're getting access to someone's identity. But the flow and what it looks like to users is mostly the same. So this has actually been proposed as a project called OpenID Connect. And I don't know exactly what our timeline is as Google to implement something like that, but this is really where we see the future going. We see the future as the ability to use OAuth to get access not only to a user's data like their calendar or their contacts, but also to get access to their identity. So you as developers don't need to deal with the complicated issues of signatures and that sort of thing. There will still be some things for discovery when we're talking about authentication, basically figuring out who a user's authentication provider is. But overall, this should make it a lot easier for getting access to a user's identity and getting access to their data by learning only a single protocol. So a variety of different resources that you have here. The Google Identity Toolkit, which I talked about earlier, is basically that toolkit to make it a lot easier to do OpenID authentication. And there's someone's email address. They were brave enough to put that up there. Please don't spam them. But if you are interested in using the Google Identity Toolkit and trying it out on your website, contact esax@google.com, and he can hook you up. And then there's some links for various other documentation. Google has one main site for all of our Auth docs. And then there's also the OAuth playground there. It's using OAuth 1, so it's a little bit different flow for the individual case. But it's a very helpful tool to learn some of this and to try out our various APIs. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there's a client login fail session that happened yesterday. Catch up on that on YouTube. And you can reach me via Twitter at RyGuyRG. And of course, if you have any feedback on this session, please submit it in that feedback link below. All right, now is time for Q&A. Questions? There are microphones. Looks like someone's already standing, so go for it.
So I have a question. On the enterprise side, it looks like it's pretty good. You know, I have somebody else making a decision for me, but when I'm using Google personally right now, you know, I'm trying to store information on there. I'm always worried about still using, you know, OpenAuth and everything, and it's because there's no granular level of access. I mean, somebody has access to my documents, there's everything. It's open. My calendar, they got access to all my calendars. You know, is there thought about creating silos where, you know, the interested party can only have access to a certain calendar or certain folders in a document? That's one question. Just kind of going back on it, you know, also, I'd like to know when they pull data from my calendar, how often they do that, and, you know, where do they store the data so that, you know, I can be knowledgeable of, you know, what they're doing with it, you know. Those two concerns there. So
yeah, two basic questions. First was about more granular level of access, and yes, you know, it's definitely something that we're looking at, and we've implemented for a couple newer APIs the ability to get access. First of all, just kind of as a read-only way versus a read-write fashion. But then we're also looking at, say, access to things like an individual Google Doc or individual Google Calendar, definitely looking at all of that. And the second was on auditability. I agree with you. That's all I'm going to say on that. But I agree with you. It would be nice to be able to see that data.
Hi, on the OpenID part of your presentation, how would OpenID work if you have a Google Apps account and your Gmail account, and your OpenID is more on the Gmail side, and you're working on your Google Apps account? Cookie-wise, it's going to be...
Yeah, so Google has a couple different types of accounts. The primary type of account that's always existed is kind of the consumer account, the regular Gmail accounts that you guys are used to. The second type of account is a Google Apps account. And we've actually tried to move these Google Apps accounts recently into becoming full, regular, you know, consumer accounts in addition to having access to the business services. I actually don't know how that works right now. I actually log in. I use incognito window for my consumer stuff and use a regular window for my business access. But I think that the way that that should access or should work is really having a choice, is having, when you go to OpenID, basically being prompted and say, which account would you like to authenticate with? We do, depending on how the developer has implemented OpenID, we do have some hints on that in the process they went through. But yeah, it's definitely something that the team's aware of, and I was actually talking with them 2 or 3 weeks ago with the engineers that are implementing this. And it's something we're aware of, and hopefully we'll fix soon for you so you don't have to use that incognito window.
Thank you.
Yep. Let's alternate back over to you.
Hi. First of all, thanks for the great talk. I'm wondering if you have anything to say about the potential privacy implications of sort of telling Google every website I log into at, you know, at exactly what time I log into that site.
Sure. So, I mean, the original version of OpenID basically returned a opaque identifier back to the website. So basically, if you went to log into TripIt and you wanted to log in using your Google account, TripIt would get back just an identifier that's a URL or URI and includes a number that TripIt doesn't know how to associate. And even the consumer version of OpenID today for Gmail accounts will actually return a different opaque identifier for every site that you visit. That being said, many websites want more information. They want to have your name and they want to have your email address. So they include what's called OpenID attribute exchange requests as part of their initial request. And when they include that, basically you see those additional elements on the authorization screen saying, is it okay to pass in your name and your email address? And you can either allow or deny. If you had websites that you really wanted to be entirely anonymous per se too, then you wouldn't want to ever approve a screen that looks like that, and you'd want to encourage those website developers to not ask for that information. We don't currently have a way to basically say, the website developer asked for it, you as a user can say, no, I want to log in, but I don't want to pass that information. We don't currently have that scenario implemented. But it's something, if there was enough requests for, is something we could, of course, look at.
So, sorry, that's all great information, but I don't think that answers my question. I'm talking about on the side of the provider, Google learning all of the different sites that I'm logging into.
Sorry. Sorry.
No, that's okay.
That's your choice to use the OpenID provider that you want to use. And if you don't like that provider knowing the different sites that you're logging into, then use a different provider that you're okay with that with. Or use your own provider with the risk that some websites might just have that NASCAR and you can't use your own provider. But yeah, I don't have any fantastic answer for you on that one. The way the protocol works is Google gets to see that information during the process.
I guess I'm just wondering if there's going to be consumer pushback or if we should expect something like that from this. Thank you.
Thanks.
Question about the refresh tokens. So around best practices, should, as application developers, we pay attention to the expiration time and request a new auth token before it expires, or just wait to get a failed authorization and try again?
It would reduce latency if you expected, if you looked at it. Basically, if you had some background process looking at when your tokens expire and knowing that the user is currently active on your site and renewing them automatically. Because otherwise, you're basically waiting to get a 401 or 403, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting which, but you're basically waiting to get that returned by Google. And if you do that, then you're adding an extra request in the process, and the user is sitting there waiting for you not only to get the error, but also to then refresh the token and then get the data. So it's really up to you, but if you have an application that you want to reduce the latency a lot, I would renew them in advance.
Just a quick question, you may not be able to answer because it might be outside your area, but App Engine currently, I believe, uses version 1 of OAuth. Is App Engine going to update to version 2 of OAuth, or are they sticking with 1?
You're right that I don't have the answer to that. I know that there are libraries. The API client for Python, I believe, has implemented. Jed is nodding his head here, yes. So yes, the API client for Python, distributed by Google, which you can use on App Engine, does support OAuth 2. But frankly, OAuth 2 is really easy to implement. Even if you don't have a library that supports it, I wouldn't be too scared about trying to implement OAuth 2.
It wasn't so much as a client, like using App Engine as a client, but you can actually use App Engine as a relying party. Or sorry, as
you mean as a OAuth? You have an API hosted on App Engine, and you're trying to authorize users accessing that API. So I don't know the answer to you. Sorry.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm wondering if developers store the refresh token in the database and say they have a Sony moment and the database gets spilled out to the public. Are those refresh tokens worth anything by themselves outside of the developer, outside of the app of the developer who have requested it?
They would need to have, in addition to that refresh token, they would need to have that client ID and client secret in addition. So I'm trying to think here. In general, I think that as long as they weren't able to get on the client secret, they would be okay, because I'm pretty sure the client secret is only ever communicated in server-to-server posts from the server, or from the client, from the web application to Google using HTTPS, so it's stored securely somewhere in their environment. I'd still be slightly concerned, but I think as long as you're storing that data separately, that would be a best practice.
They'll need more than just that.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Don't get your database compromised, though. How's that?
Hi. I think a lot of us are sort of having tinfoil hat moments with the APIs and all that stuff. Is there any way for the end user to know how scrupulous or not a web application is when they are using OAuth or OpenID? Is there any sort of certification process or anything like that for us to know when we do allow this token and all of this other behind-the-scenes stuff, how securely it's being implemented?
We don't have anything that we can provide you for that. I would talk to the people who are implementing, talk to the web applications that you're considering using and ask them for more information on their practices. Look at, who they're funded by, look at a variety of different things to determine how much you trust that company. But Google does not have any sort of certification on that.
Okay, are the sort of auditing companies aware of how this works? Do they have best practices for us to follow? Basically, how much third-party support is there for really, really solid, secure use of OAuth and OpenID?
There are certainly consulting firms that specialize in this type of stuff. There are companies that actually implement it for you, and you can just kind of use their APIs, like things like Janrain is an example of one of those companies, Janrain, and they've actually implemented a lot of the open source libraries as well for it. But that's my best recommendation right now would be check out some of those companies and certainly do some due diligence when you're evaluating applications.
Thank you.
Hi. Please, could you elaborate why did you use OAuth 1 in the second business use case?
Sure. So basically, OAuth 2, the way we've implemented it thus far, requires that the user have an active session in their browser in order to do that initial grant. And the user is granting access to only their data. In the case of the business use case where you want an IT admin to grant access to the data for the entire organization, we just haven't implemented that yet in an OAuth 2 style flow. So it's just a question of time more than anything else.
Thank you.
Hey, Ryan.
Hey.
Let's say you have two websites that are implementing Google for authentication, and instead of actually using OAuth to pull data from Google, you actually wanted to use, would you be able to support where they both use a Google login, but now they actually can pull data from each other and they're not, as opposed to pulling data from Google?
So one of them is pulling data from Google, and then the other one?
Neither of them. So
neither
they're
of them
just both using Google for authentication.
You would basically be establishing some sort of trust between those two servers, and you could use OAuth, basically have those two services use OAuth for that trust back and forth, but it's not something that Google itself, would be involved in. You would use authentication, you'd use OpenID for authentication to get access to the user's identity, but then to kind of transmit data between the two servers, you'd probably use OAuth with some sort of trust between those two servers.
Right, so you have to implement your own OAuth.
Yeah. I mean, you could use other protocols, but that would be one way to do it.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Hi. Facebook and LinkedIn have implemented OAuth 2 in the user agent flow, which doesn't involve secrets at all. This is very useful for developers who want to just do client-side authentication. Does Google support that? I see OAuth 2.0 with the last step in the dance is about exchanging that access token for using the code.
Yeah, we do support an entirely user agent-based flow. I didn't really get into the details in the presentation. We do support an entirely user agent-based dance where you could do it purely from JavaScript. There may still be a secret, but the secret is known to everyone, so you just need to be aware of that.
That kind of sucks, right?
And I'm not sure if our current flow, I know that some of the folks like LinkedIn have implemented it where the user actually has to have a current active session in order to refresh their access token, whereas the implementation that I showed, the user doesn't have an active session. But I'm not sure what our support is for that yet. I could certainly talk with you afterwards and get more info.
I'll reach out to you.
All right.
Chip, what's the relationship between what you've talked about today and open social?
So all right, I have 30 seconds.
I'll talk to you afterwards.
And yes, let's chat afterwards. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.